The surgical lights burned white hot above Thomas Bennett's face as gloved hands peeled the blood-soaked shirt from his back. A nurse gasped. Dr. Morrison stepped closer, her expression shifting from routine concern to something Thomas couldn't name: horror, maybe, or disbelief. "How long?" she asked quietly. Thomas tried to remember. 6 months, 7. The timeline blurred under morphine and exhaustion. His back, what remained of it, resembled scorched earth, black tissue, weeping craters where skin should be. The infection had burrowed so deep that nurses could see muscle fiber through the decay. "We need cultures immediately," Morrison said, her voice tight, "and call infectious disease." Through the fog of pain, Thomas remembered standing in his new rental's doorway last winter, smiling. He'd found the perfect retirement home, affordable, quiet. Just 3 small pimples on his back then, 3 tiny dots that would cost him everything. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Along with the city you're watching from now, let's continue with the story. Thomas Bennett had taught American history for 32 years at Riverside High School in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He knew every battle of the Civil War, every clause of the Constitution, every president's middle name. What he didn't know, at 58 years old, was how to stop trusting people. His modest ranch house sat 3 blocks from Lake Michigan, filled with sagging bookshelves and a leather armchair he'd owned since his teaching days began. The chair's arms were worn smooth from decades of evening reading, a geography of his quiet life mapped in cracked leather. He lived alone now, had for 10 years since Linda left, except for Max, his 9-year-old golden retriever who'd grown gray around the muzzle alongside him. Retirement should have meant peace. Instead, it meant watching his savings account shrink with frightening speed. His son David showed up on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, snow clinging to his work boots. At 32, David still carried himself like a teenager caught doing something wrong, shoulders hunched, eyes avoiding direct contact. He worked as a mechanic when he worked at all. 2 kids from a marriage that hadn't survived, 8 months unemployed. "Dad, I need to ask you something." Thomas marked his page in a biography of Lincoln. "What is it?" $15,000. David's words came out in a rush. "I'm opening my own shop, got a building lined up, equipment ready. Just need the startup capital, because I'll pay you back in 6 months. I promise." Thomas had heard promises before, but David was his son, his only child. And wasn't a father supposed to believe? He withdrew the money from his retirement fund the next morning, watched his balance drop from comfortable to concerning. David left with the check and a hug that felt too brief, too hollow. 3 weeks later, Max collapsed during their morning walk. The veterinary bill's emergency surgery for hip dysplasia cost another $3,000. Thomas paid with his credit card and tried not to calculate how many months of careful budgeting he'd just erased. That's when he found the listing on Craigslist. A 3-bedroom house near the lake for $750 a month, 40% below market rate. The address was in an older neighborhood, but the photos looked decent. Hardwood floors, large windows, a yard for Max. He called the number. A woman answered, her voice warm and grandmotherly. "Yes, it's still available." Eleanor Walsh said, "My husband passed 2 years ago. It's too much house for me now." They met the following Saturday. Eleanor was 70, soft-spoken, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She walked Thomas through the rooms, apologizing for the dated wallpaper, the old fixtures. "There's a basement," she mentioned as they finished the tour, "but I keep it locked. Storage, mostly. Nothing you'd need to worry about." Thomas signed the lease that afternoon. A penny saved is a penny earned, his father's words. Now his philosophy. He moved in 2 weeks before Christmas, David helping load boxes into a borrowed truck. As Thomas carried his books across the threshold, he felt something close to hope. The house smelled like possibility, like starting over. The first bump appeared 3 weeks after Thomas moved in, a small red welt between his shoulder blades that itched like a mosquito bite in January. He twisted in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to see it clearly. But the angle was wrong, and his aging joints protested the contortion. "Probably just dry skin," he muttered, reaching for the bottle of lotion Linda had left behind years ago. The expiration date had long passed, but lotion was lotion. By the end of the second week, there were more. 4, then 7, then too many to count without craning his neck until it ached. They clustered across his upper back like a constellation he couldn't name. The itching intensified at night, dragging him from sleep. He'd wake at 3 in the morning, clawing at his shirt, the fabric damp with sweat. Max started acting strange around the same time. The old retriever would pad to the basement door and whine, a low, anxious sound that made Thomas uneasy. When Thomas opened the door to investigate, Max would bark sharp, urgent barks that echoed up the wooden stairs into darkness. "There's nothing down there, boy," Thomas said, but he didn't go down to check. Eleanor had said it was just storage. He respected her privacy. His neighbor from next door knocked one afternoon while Thomas was bringing in groceries. Margaret Foster was 68, a widow who'd lived in the house beside his for 40 years. She had that particular brand of friendly nosiness that came from decades of watching neighborhoods change. "Settling in all right?" she asked, eyeing the generic brand cereal and discount bread in his bags. "Just fine. Thank you. You look tired. If you don't mind me saying." Her gaze sharpened. "Everything okay?" Thomas realized he'd been scratching his shoulder unconsciously. He forced his hand down. "Probably need new laundry detergent. Skin's been a bit irritated. You should see a doctor." "It's nothing serious." Margaret's expression suggested she disagreed, but she simply nodded. "Well, if you need anything, I'm right next door." That evening, David called. They hadn't spoken since the move, and Thomas felt an uncomfortable flutter of hope when his son's name appeared on the phone screen. "Hey, Dad, how's the new place?" "Good. Quiet." Thomas paused. "How's the shop coming along?" A brief silence. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. The equipment cost ran higher than I expected. I need another $5,000 to get things operational, just until we open and start seeing revenue." Thomas closed his eyes. His retirement account balance flashed in his mind like a warning light. "David, I can't—" "Never mind." His son's voice turned cold. "I thought you believed in me." "I do believe in you, but I gave you $15,000 3 weeks ago. I have to be careful with—" "Forget it." The line went dead. Thomas sat in his worn armchair, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone. Through the floor, he heard Max barking at the basement door again. The sound seemed to come from very far away. He walked to the bathroom and twisted to examine his back in the mirror. The bumps had multiplied. Some looked angry now, dazed and inflamed. One had started weeping a clear fluid that stained his undershirt. Thomas bought hydrocortisone cream at the pharmacy the next morning. Behind the counter, the pharmacist, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced at the cream and then at him. "Is it working?" she asked. "Excuse me." "The cream. You bought the same tube 3 days ago." Had he? Thomas couldn't remember. The nights had begun blurring together. Sleep fractured by itching and Max's persistent barking. "I must have misplaced it," he said. He didn't tell her that the cream did nothing, that the bumps were spreading down his spine now, onto his shoulders, that sometimes, late at night, he could feel them pulsing with their own heartbeat. Thomas stopped sleeping in his bed during the 6th week. The bumps had transformed into something worse, pustules that wept and ruptured, leaving raw craters that stuck to his sheets. Every morning he'd peel his shirt away from his back, biting down on his tongue to keep from crying out as fabric tore away scabs that hadn't had time to form properly. He slept sitting up now, or tried to, nodding off in his leather armchair with his chest pressed against a pillow. 20-minute intervals of unconsciousness between waves of pain that felt like hot coals pressed against his spine. The smell came next, a sour, rotten sweetness that reminded him of the time a mouse had died inside his classroom wall years ago. He showered twice a day, scrubbing carefully around the lesions, but the odor seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than soap could reach. Max wouldn't come near him any more. The dog would enter a room, catch Thomas's scent, and retreat with his tail between his legs. It broke something in Thomas's chest to watch his oldest friend recoil from him. "It's still me, boy," he whispered one night, but Max only whined from the hallway. By the 7th week, Thomas couldn't lift his arms above his shoulders. The infection, because that's what it was now, he couldn't pretend otherwise, had spread across his upper back like a map of some terrible country. Inflammation made movement agony. He stopped volunteering at the library, stopped answering Margaret's calls, stopped pretending he was fine. The fever started on a Monday, low grade at first, 99 degrees that made him shiver despite the house's warmth. By Wednesday, it had climbed to 100.2. His hands shook when he tried to make coffee. The mug slipped from his fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor, and Thomas stood staring at the pieces, unable to remember why he'd wanted coffee in the first place. That afternoon, Max started coughing, small hacks at first, then deep rattling sounds that came from his chest. Thomas knelt beside the dog, running his trembling hands through golden fur that had lost its luster. "You too?" he asked. "What's wrong with this house?" The veterinary clinic was across town. Thomas drove with his back barely touching the seat, every bump in the road sending lightning bolts of pain down his spine. Max sat in the passenger seat, breathing hard, his dark eyes reflecting something that looked like fear. Patricia Chen examined Max with gentle hands and a deepening frown. She pressed her stethoscope to the dog's chest, moved it, pressed again, took his temperature, drew blood for tests. "His lungs sound terrible," she said. "Has he been exposed to anything unusual?" Chemicals, smoke. Thomas thought about the basement door, Max's obsessive barking. "We moved recently. Old house. Could there be something? Environmental causes are possible." Dr. Chen made notes on her tablet. Mold, allergens, poor air quality. Where are you living?" He gave her the address. She didn't react, just nodded and continued writing. "I'm starting him on antibiotics and a steroid to reduce inflammation. But Mr. Bennett," she looked at him carefully, "you don't look well yourself. Are you experiencing any respiratory symptoms? It's just my back, some kind of skin irritation. Have you seen a doctor?" He couldn't afford another copay, another round of medications that might not work. I have an appointment," he lied. "The antibiotics cost $680. Thomas used his credit card and tried not to calculate the interest. Max died 3 days later. Thomas found him in the morning lying on his dog bed in the kitchen, his chest still, no struggle, no sound, just gone, as if he'd decided sleep was easier than breathing. Thomas buried him in the backyard under the maple tree, crying for the first time since Linda left. He dug with his arms, screaming in protest, his back weeping fluid into his shirt. And he didn't care. Max deserved better than this house, better than dying at 9 years old because his owner had been too cheap and too proud to demand answers. The ground was still soft when Thomas finally made the appointment with Dr. Harrison, his family physician. It took 3 weeks to get in. 3 weeks of sleeping in his chair, of changing bandages he'd bought at the pharmacy, of watching his back transform into something that belonged in a medical textbook illustration of bacterial infection. Dr. Harrison barely looked at the lesions. He spent 90 seconds examining Thomas's back, hummed noncommittally, and reached for his prescription pad. "Folliculitis," he pronounced. "Common bacterial infection of hair follicles. Stress-related, usually. You said you just retired." "Yes, but there you go. Big life change, weakened immune response, happens all the time." He scribbled on the pad. "Mupirocin ointment twice daily. Should clear up in 2 weeks. Try to reduce stress. Maybe take up meditation." Thomas stared at the prescription in his hand. After everything, after Max, after the sleepless nights, after watching his body revolt against itself, the answer was meditation. What if it doesn't get better? "Then we'll try oral antibiotics. But I'm confident this will work. I've been practicing medicine for 20 years. Mr. Bennett, I know folliculitis when I see it." The appointment cost $150. Thomas paid with his credit card and walked to his car through the February cold, feeling the lesions crack and weep under his coat. That night, he sat in his chair and looked at Max's empty bed. The basement door stood closed at the end of the hallway, and from somewhere behind it came a sound like water dripping, steady, patient, endless. Thomas applied the ointment as directed and had told himself that doctors knew best. He wanted so badly to believe it. The ointment did nothing. 2 weeks passed, and Thomas's back deteriorated from infected to catastrophic. The lesions merged into larger wounds, raw flesh exposed where skin had simply given up. He couldn't wear shirts anymore. The fabric adhered to the seeping tissue like glue. He lived in a loose bathrobe, moving through his house like a ghost haunting his own life. He stopped showering. The water pressure felt like needles. He cleaned himself with damp towels, carefully, crying sometimes from the pain. His bathroom trash can filled with blood-stained gauze and medical tape. The smell in the house intensified, sweet and putrid, the smell of decay. Dr. Harrison's office said the earliest follow-up appointment was 3 weeks away. Standard protocol, nothing they could do. Thomas tried to sleep sitting up, but the exhaustion had become a living thing inside him, dragging him down. One morning he woke on the living room floor, unsure how he'd gotten there. His bathrobe had fallen open. Blood had dried on the hardwood in a pattern that looked almost artistic. He was staring at it, trying to find the energy to stand, when he heard knocking. "Thomas, Thomas, are you in there?" Margaret's voice. He didn't answer, couldn't face her, couldn't let her see him like this. The knocking intensified. "Thomas, I'm coming in. You gave me the spare key, remember, for emergencies?" He'd forgotten. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Margaret stood in the doorway, grocery bags in her hands, and the bags hit the floor. "Oh, my God!" She crossed the room in seconds, kneeling beside him. "Oh, my God, Thomas, how long have you been like this?" "I'm fine." His voice came out as a whisper, just needed to rest. "You're lying in blood." Her hands hovered over him, afraid to touch it. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No? Can't afford?" "I don't care what you can afford." She already had her phone out. "You're dying. Do you understand? You're dying on your living room floor." The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. The paramedics, a young man and woman who moved with practiced efficiency, cut away his bathrobe with scissors. The woman inhaled sharply when she saw his back. "Sir, how long has it been like this?" Thomas tried to remember. Weeks, months. Time had become liquid. "We need to move him carefully," the young man said. "This is severe tissue necrosis, possible sepsis." They lifted him onto the stretcher. Every movement sent shock waves through his nervous system. Margaret held his hand in the ambulance, and Thomas noticed absently that she was crying. "I should have checked on you sooner," she said. "I knocked last week, and you didn't answer, and I thought you just wanted privacy. I'm so sorry." "Not your fault," Thomas managed. "Not anyone's fault." But that was a lie, and they both knew it. Grand Rapids Medical Center's emergency room was fluorescent bright and antiseptic cold. Nurses swarmed him, starting IV, taking vitals, cutting away the remaining bandages. A doctor appeared young, competent-looking, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. "I'm Dr. Morrison," she said. "Dermatology. Someone made the right call bringing you here." She snapped on latex gloves and leaned over his back. Her expression shifted from professional to deeply concerned. "Mr. Bennett, I'm going to be direct with you. This is one of the worst cases of skin infection I've seen outside a battlefield. We need to run tests immediately, blood cultures, tissue samples, imaging." When did this start? He told her about the bumps, about Dr. Harrison's diagnosis, about the ointment that did nothing. De Morrison's jaw tightened. "Folliculitis." She said it like a curse. "Did anyone biopsy the lesions, run cultures?" "No." "He just looked, and of course he did." She turned to a nurse. "I want CBC, metabolic panel, blood cultures, and a tissue biopsy stat, page infectious disease, and get me everything you can find on—" She paused. "Mr. Bennett, tell me about your living situation. Where exactly do you live?" He gave her the address. "How long have you been there?" 3 months, almost 3 months. "Any water damage? Musty smells? Any issues with the house itself?" Thomas thought about Max, about the basement door, about the dripping sound he heard at night. "There's a basement. The landlady said not to go down there. And my dog died. Respiratory failure." De Morrison's expression darkened. We're testing for environmental pathogens, mold exposure, specifically toxic varieties. Your symptoms, the skin infection, your dog's respiratory death, they fit a pattern. Mold. Thomas felt stupid saying it. Mold did this, not directly, but prolonged exposure to certain molds releases mycorrhizins that suppress immune function. Once your body's defenses are down, opportunistic bacteria move in. What started as irritation becomes infection, then necrosis. She paused, her eyes meeting his. Mr. Bennett, if you'd waited another week to come in, you'd likely have developed septic shock. You'd be dead. The words hung in the sterile air, dead. Such a simple word for such a permanent condition. I'm admitting you immediately. Dr. Morrison continued, intravenous antibiotics, surgical debridement of the necrotic tissue, aggressive wound care. You'll be here at least 10 days, and you absolutely cannot return to that house. I don't have anywhere else, Thomas said. Margaret squeezed his hand. Yes, you do. You're staying with me. I won't hear any arguments. A nurse approached with papers, insurance information, treatment consent forms, estimated costs. Thomas saw the numbers and felt his stomach drop. $45,000, even with Medicare. His portion would be $18,000 or more than a third of what remained in his retirement account. He signed anyway. What choice did he have? They wheeled him to a private room and started the first antibiotic infusion. Vancomycin, they called it, for serious gram-positive infections. The IV bag hung above him like a promise. Clear fluid dripping into his veins at precise intervals. De Morrison returned an hour later. We're sending an environmental assessment team to your rental property tomorrow. I want documentation of what's in that house. If your landlady knowingly rented you a contaminated property, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Thomas lay in the hospital bed and watched the antibiotic drip. His back throbbed with each heartbeat. Through the window, he could see snow beginning to fall, soft and clean, and nothing like the rot that had been eating him alive. Margaret sat in the chair beside his bed, reading a magazine she wasn't really reading. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. She looked up. "For what? For not letting me die alone in that house?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. "You're not alone, Thomas. You never were. You just forgot to ask for help." "I didn't want to be a burden. That's what men your age always say." She smiled sadly. "Too proud to admit you're drowning until the water's over your head. My husband was the same way. Outside, the snow fell heavier." Thomas closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to not be in pain. The memory felt impossibly distant, like something that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. The antibiotic dripped. His heart beat, somewhere in the hospital. Machines beeped their electronic reassurances that he was still alive. For now, that would have to be enough. The antibiotics worked like a miracle in reverse, slowly, painfully, revealing the true extent of damage beneath. For 10 days, Thomas lay on his stomach while nurses changed his bandages, cleaned his wounds, administered medications through the IV line that had become a permanent fixture in his arm. De Morrison visited twice daily, monitoring his progress with cautious optimism. "The infection is responding," she said on day 7. "White blood cell count is dropping. No signs of sepsis. You're lucky. Mr. Bennett, very lucky. Lucky wasn't the word Thomas would have chosen. Lucky people didn't end up with their backs carved into the topographical maps of suffering. Lucky people didn't lose their dogs, their savings, their dignity to a house that was slowly killing them. But he was alive. That counted for something. Margaret came every day, bringing books and magazines, sitting in the visitor's chair, doing crossword puzzles, while Thomas drifted in and out of morphine-tinged sleep. She never asked for thanks, never made him feel like an obligation. She just showed up. On day 8, she brought news. The environmental team finished their inspection, she said, pulling her chair closer to his bed. Thomas, you need to prepare yourself. It's bad. He'd been expecting bad. He got catastrophic. The basement had been flooded for at least 8 months, possibly longer. A broken pipe had gone undetected, creating a perfect breeding ground for black mold Stachybotrys chartarum, the most toxic variety. The mold had colonized 70% of the basement surface area, releasing spores that the house's broken ventilation system had circulated throughout every room. The inspector measured 300,000 spores per cubic meter. The safe threshold was 500. Thomas had been breathing poison for 3 months. They're condemning the property, Margaret said. No one can live there until it's professionally remediated. The estimate is between $35,000 and $50,000. That's the landlady's problem, not mine. Yes, and there's something else. Margaret hesitated. The inspector found evidence this wasn't the first time. There were medical records in the basement. Someone else got sick there 2 years ago. The landlady paid for their hospital bills in exchange for keeping quiet. The anger started as a small flame in Thomas's chest and grew into a bonfire. Eleanor Walsh had known. She'd known her house was toxic and she'd rented it to him anyway, watched him move in with his dog and his books and his naive trust in human decency, and she'd said nothing. I want her contact information. Thomas said, I already called her. Margaret replied, she's not answering. I went to the address on your lease. She doesn't live there anymore. Her daughter answered the door. Her daughter, Patricia Walsh. She's a real estate attorney. Thomas, she knows exactly what her mother did. The flame became an inferno. De Morrison discharged him on day 10 with a bag full of prescriptions, a detailed wound care schedule, and stern instructions. You're not out of the woods yet. The infection is controlled but not eliminated. Continue the oral antibiotics for 6 weeks. Change dressings twice daily. Any sign of fever, increased pain, or spreading redness, you come back immediately. Understood? Thomas. Understood. He also understood that 6 weeks of antibiotics would cost another $1,000. That follow-up appointments would drain what little remained of his savings. That he was financially ruined by a house that had tried to kill him. Margaret drove him to her home, a tidy ranch style with a guest bedroom already prepared. She'd bought new sheets, stocked the bathroom with supplies, even picked up the prescription medications on her way to the hospital. How much do I owe you? Thomas asked. Nothing. You owe me nothing. Margaret, Thomas, stop. She turned to face him. I'm 78 years old. My husband died 15 years ago. My children live in California. I have more money than I need and more time than I know what to do with. Helping you isn't charity. It's giving my life meaning. So, please, for the love of God, just say thank you. and let me do this." He said, "Thank you," that afternoon, rested and clear-headed for the first time in months. Thomas made a call. Attorney Michael Preston specialized in tenant rights and landlord negligence. His consultation fee was $200. His retainer was $10,000. Thomas had $12,000 left in his accessible savings. "Tell me everything," Preston said. Thomas told him. The rental agreement, the basement clause, the environmental report, the evidence of prior illness. Preston took notes, asked questions, requested documentation. "This is textbook negligent endangerment," Preston said when Thomas finished. "She knowingly rented you an uninhabitable property. That's illegal in Michigan. You have grounds for a substantial lawsuit, medical costs, pain and suffering, possibly punitive damages. How long will it take? If we settle out of court, 3 to 6 months. If it goes to trial, could be a year or more." Thomas closed his eyes. A year of legal battles, while his savings evaporated and his back healed into permanent scars. But what choice did he have? Someone needed to be held accountable. "Do it," he said. "File the lawsuit." Preston promised to have papers ready within the week. 2 days later, Thomas drove to the address Margaret had given him, the one where Patricia Walsh had answered the door. It was a expensive neighborhood, manicured lawns, 2-car garages, the kind of prosperity that came from inherited wealth and strategic cruelty. Patricia answered his knock. She was 45, sharp-featured, dressed in business casual that probably cost more than Thomas's monthly pension. Her expression cycled through surprise, recognition, and carefully constructed neutrality in under 3 seconds. "Mr. Bennett, I want to speak with your mother." "My mother isn't available." "Then I'll speak with you." Thomas held up a folder. "This is the environmental report from my rental property, the one your mother owns, the one that nearly killed me. I have documentation that she knew about the mold, that she's paid off at least one previous tenant to keep quiet. I'm filing a lawsuit for $80,000 in damages." Patricia's expression didn't change. "Mr. Bennett, my mother is a 70-year-old widow living on a fixed income. She made a mistake in judgment, yes, but—" "A mistake?" Thomas felt his voice rising. "Your mother rented me a house full of toxic mold. My dog died. I spent 10 days in the hospital with an infection that could have killed me. My back looks like someone took a blowtorch to it. That's not a mistake. That's criminal negligence. I understand you're upset. I'm beyond upset. I'm destroyed. Financially, physically, emotionally destroyed. And for what? So your mother could collect $750 a month." Patricia pulled an envelope from her pocket. "I'm authorized to offer you $5,000 as a settlement. In exchange, you drop any legal action and sign a non-disclosure agreement." Thomas stared at the envelope. $5,000. Less than a third of his medical bills. Less than a tenth of what he'd lost. "No," he said. "Be reasonable. Mr. Bennett, my mother can't afford $80,000. You'll win the lawsuit and get nothing because she has nothing to give." "Then she should have thought about that before she poisoned me." He walked back to his car, hands shaking with fear. Behind him, Patricia called out, "You're making a mistake. We have good lawyers." Thomas didn't turn around. He got in his car, drove back to Margaret's house. and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes trying to calm down. Through the window, he could see Margaret in her kitchen, probably making dinner, probably worrying about him. Good people existed. He'd forgotten that in the months of suffering, but Margaret proved it daily. She'd saved his life without being asked. She'd given him shelter without expecting payment. She was proof that kindness still lived in the world. But so did Eleanor Walsh. So did Patricia with her $5,000 insult. Thomas got out of the car and went inside. Margaret had made pot roast, his favorite. They ate together at her kitchen table, and she didn't ask about his afternoon. She just passed him the potatoes and told him about the book club meeting she'd attended, keeping the conversation light and normal. Normal felt like a gift that night, lying in Margaret's guest bed with his back throbbing despite the pain medication. Thomas thought about justice, about accountability, about the long road ahead. He thought about winning. He had to believe winning was possible, because the alternative, accepting that bad people could destroy your life and face no consequences, was unthinkable. Thomas was sitting at Margaret's kitchen table reviewing medical bills when his laptop pinged with a new email. Attorney Preston requesting any correspondence with Eleanor Walsh prior to signing the lease. Thomas opened his email archive and began searching through months of messages, looking for anything that might strengthen his case. He found something else instead. The email was dated 4 months earlier, 2 weeks before Thomas had signed the lease. The sender was David Bennett. The recipient was Eleanor Walsh. Subject line, re-rental for my father. Thomas's hand froze on the mouse. He clicked it open. The exchange was brief, devastating. David had inquired about the rental listing, mentioned his father needed affordable housing, asked about move-in costs. Eleanor had responded honestly, perhaps the only honest thing she'd done, mentioning that the basement had moisture issues and the house needed work. David's reply made Thomas's blood turn cold. He's old and doesn't get around much. Will he really notice basement problems? I need the cheapest place possible. He's helping me with some expenses, and I need to keep his costs down. Can you do $750 if he doesn't inspect the basement? Eleanor had agreed. Thomas read the email 3 times. 4, 5. The words didn't change. His son, his only child, the boy he'd raised and loved and trusted with $15,000, had knowingly placed him in a toxic house to save money. Money Thomas had given him. Money David had claimed was for starting a business. His hands started shaking. The laptop screen blurred. He stood up so fast his chair toppled backward and walked up to the bathroom, bent over the sink, and vomited. When the heaving stopped, he called David. Dad, hey, I was just thinking about, did you know? Thomas's voice came out raw. Did you know about the mold? Silence. In that silence, Thomas heard everything. I don't know what you're talking about. I found the emails. David, between you and Eleanor Walsh, you asked if I would notice basement problems. You negotiated a cheaper rate if I didn't inspect the property. More silence. Then, Dad, listen. You knew you put me in a house that was killing me because you needed to save money on my rent. My rent, David. The place I was living so I could afford to keep helping you. I didn't think it was that serious. Some moisture in a basement isn't... My dog died. I spent 10 days in a hospital. I have $18,000 in medical debt. The infection nearly reached my bloodstream. Another week and I would have died. David died. You're being dramatic. Old houses always have some issues. Something broke in Thomas then, some fundamental belief that family meant safety, that blood created obligation, that being a father meant your child would never deliberately harm you. "How much do you really owe?" he asked quietly. "What? You said 35,000. How much is it really?" The pause stretched. "It doesn't matter." "How much?" "David, 78,000. The words came out in a rush. Credit cards, personal loans, some other stuff. I got in over my head, and I thought if I could just buy some time, if I could reduce expenses and use what you gave me to negotiate settlements. "You don't have a shop? You never had a shop?" "No." Thomas sat down on the bathroom floor, phone pressed to his ear. "Was any of it true? Anything you told me? I was trying to fix things. You were trying to save yourself by sacrificing me, your 78-year-old father who trusted you, who gave you $15,000 he couldn't afford to lose because you're his son and fathers are supposed to believe in their children." "I'm sorry." David's voice cracked. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I never thought it would get this bad. I thought you'd be there for a few months, save some money, and—" "Get out." Thomas said it calmly, coldly. "Get out of my life. Don't call, don't write, don't show up at holidays or birthdays or my funeral. You traded my health for your debt. That's not something you come back from. Please, Dad." Thomas ended the call. He sat on Margaret's bathroom floor and stared at the white tile and thought about the moment David was born, the overwhelming love he'd felt holding that tiny body, the promises he'd made to protect him, raise him right, give him a good life. He'd kept those promises. David had broken his— Margaret knocked softly. "Thomas, I heard shouting. Are you all right?" He couldn't answer. She opened the door and found him there. And without asking questions, she sat down beside him on the cold tile and took his hand. "My son knew," Thomas said finally, "about the house. He knew it was dangerous, and he put me there anyway." Margaret said nothing, just held his hand tighter. That evening, the doorbell rang. Margaret answered it while Thomas lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how he'd raised someone capable of such betrayal. He heard voices, Margaret's quiet murmur and a man's louder protests. Then Margaret appeared in his doorway. "There's someone here to see you. I told him to leave, but he's insistent." Thomas sat up, wincing at the pull of healing skin. "Who?" "He says he's from St. Mary's Church. Something about a fundraiser." The visitor was Gerald Hoffman, the church treasurer. Thomas had met him once at a potluck Margaret had dragged him to, mid-60s. Silver hair, a firm handshake, and a warm smile. He stood in Margaret's living room now looking decidedly less warm. "Mr. Bennett, I'm sorry to bother you. Margaret organized a fundraiser for your medical expenses through our congregation. We raised $16,500. Thomas felt something crack in his chest. Strangers had given him $16,000. His own son had given him toxic mold. "That's incredibly generous," he managed. "Thank you." Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, there's been a complication. When I went to write the check from the church account, I discovered there was only $8,200 available." "I don't understand." "I borrowed $8,300. Gerald said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. "My daughter's wedding costs ran over budget, and I needed to cover the venue deposit. I fully intended to replace it before anyone noticed, but Margaret requested the funds earlier than expected. I'll have the money back within 2 weeks, I promise. My retirement disbursement comes through on the 1st. Thomas looked at Margaret. Her face had gone pale. You stole from a fundraiser, she said quietly, for a man fighting for his life. I borrowed. There's a difference, and I'm making it right. Get out of my house. Margaret's voice was steel. Get out and don't come back. Gerald left, still protesting. Margaret closed the door behind him and leaned against it. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I thought we could help. I thought people would do the right thing. You did the right thing, Thomas said. You, the people who donated, did the right thing. Gerald made his choice. But the damage was done. By the next day, word had spread through St. Mary's congregation. Half the church members demanded Gerald's resignation and criminal charges. The other half, the ones who knew Gerald's family, who'd attended his daughter's wedding, who understood financial desperation, argued for forgiveness and redemption. The church split down the middle. The fundraiser money became toxic, tainted by scandal. Margaret received angry calls from both sides. Some accused her of causing division. Others praised her integrity. The pastor suggested it might be best if she stopped organizing charity events for a while. Let things cool down. Thomas lay in the guest room and listened to Margaret's muffled crying through the wall. He'd lost his health, his savings, his home, his dog, and his son. Now he was costing Margaret her church community. Everyone who tried to help him got hurt. Maybe he was the toxic one. Maybe the mold had just revealed what was already there, a man who destroyed everything he touched. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Mr. Bennett, this is Patricia Walsh. My mother would like to speak with you. She has information you should hear. Please call. Thomas deleted the text. He didn't want to hear Eleanor's excuses or apologies or explanations. He wanted justice. He wanted someone to pay for what had been done to him. But late the night, alone in the dark with his back aching and his heart broken, he wondered if justice even existed. If maybe the world was just people hurting each other in cycles of desperation and selfishness, and the only choice was how much damage you'd tolerate before you broke. He thought about David as a child, bright-eyed, full of promise. Where had it gone wrong? When had teaching him to be self-reliant become teaching him to be selfish? When had showing him how to be strong become showing him how to survive at others' expense? Thomas didn't have answers. He had medical debt and a scarred back, and the wreckage of relationships scattered around him like shrapnel. Through the wall, Margaret's crying had stopped. He heard her moving round, probably making tea, still trying to hold things together. Tomorrow, he'd tell her she didn't have to, that she'd done enough, more than enough, that he needed to figure out how to stand on his own before he dragged anyone else down with him. Tonight, he just lay in the dark and let the weight of betrayal settle into his bones like winter cold. Some wounds, he was learning, went deeper than skin. Attorney Preston called 3 days later with news that changed everything. I've been doing background research on Eleanor Walsh, he said. Thomas. There's something you need to know. Her husband, Robert, died 2 years ago. The death certificate lists cause of death as metastatic lung cancer. But I pulled his medical records with proper authorization, and the timeline is revealing. Thomas sat at Margaret's kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear. What am I looking at? Robert Walsh was diagnosed with aspergillosis, a fungal lung infection, 18 months before his cancer diagnosis. It's caused by prolonged exposure to toxic mold, specifically Stachybotrys, the same mold in your rental property. The oncology reports note that his immune system was severely compromised before the cancer developed. Thomas, that house killed Eleanor's husband. The words hung in the air, like smoke. She knew, Thomas said slowly. She knew because she watched it kill him. There's more. I found 2 previous tenants through property records and cross-referenced with hospital admissions. Helen Martinez, 73, was hospitalized for severe pneumonia after living there for 4 months. James Cooper, 61, developed chronic respiratory issues. Both moved out within 6 months. I tracked them down. Helen received $8,000 from Eleanor paid directly to the hospital in exchange for a signed NDA. James got his security deposit back doubled and left quietly. Thomas felt dizzy. How many people has she hurt? At least 4 that I can document, including you, possibly more. Here's what I think happened. After Robert died, Eleanor couldn't afford to remediate the property. The estimates would have been $40,000 to $50,000. She's living on Social Security and whatever Robert left her, so she made a choice, keep renting the house and hope the tenants wouldn't notice or wouldn't sue. That's monstrous. It's desperate, Preston corrected, which doesn't make it right, but it contextualizes it. I did more digging. Eleanor has a granddaughter, Emma, age 12, severe Down syndrome, requires full-time care. Eleanor's been paying for a specialized care facility since her daughter Patricia lost her job 18 months ago, $2,200 a month. The information rearranged itself in Thomas's mind like puzzle pieces forming a picture he didn't want to see. A dying husband, a disabled grandchild, a woman trapped between impossible choices. It didn't excuse what Eleanor had done, but it explained it. She's still liable, Preston said, legally and morally. But I wanted you to have the full picture before we proceed. That afternoon, a letter arrived, hand-delivered by Patricia Walsh, who wouldn't meet Thomas's eyes when she handed it to him at Margaret's door. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive. Inside, Eleanor's handwriting, shaky but legible. Dear Mr. Bennett, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But you deserve the truth. Hope my husband Robert worked in that house's basement for 30 years, his workshop, his sanctuary. When the pipe broke, we didn't notice for months. By the time we did, he was already sick. I watched him deteriorate, watched the mold eat his lungs from the inside. The doctor said if we'd caught it earlier, if he'd stopped breathing those spores, he might have lived after he died. I had the basement tested, 300,000 spores per cubic meter. The remediation estimate was $47,000. I had $11,000 in savings and a mortgage. I couldn't afford to fix it. I couldn't afford to leave. My granddaughter Emma needs me. Her mother, my daughter, lost everything in a divorce. Emma's care facility cost more than my Social Security check. I kept telling myself I'd fix the house soon, get a loan somehow. I kept telling myself the tenants would be fine if they just stayed out of the basement. I was wrong. I was horribly, unforgivably wrong. Helen Martinez nearly died because of my cowardice. I paid her hospital bills and lived with the guilt. When James Cooper started coughing, I let him out of his lease early and prayed and he'd be okay. Then you moved in, and I told myself this time would be different, that you seemed healthy and strong, that maybe the mold wasn't as bad as I feared. I watched you carry boxes into that house with your dog, and I said nothing. I collected your rent checks, and I said nothing. Your son David told me you didn't need to inspect the basement, and I said nothing because it was easier, because I needed the money, because I've become the kind of person who trades others' lives for her own convenience. 3 days ago, I sold my daughter's house, the one thing Robert left us. Besides the toxic property, I got $52,000. After paying the real estate fees and the remaining mortgage, I have $43,000 left. It's yours, all of it. It won't undo the damage, but it's everything I have. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm asking that you understand I'm not a monster, just a coward who made terrible choices when the person I loved needed help. The house is being demolished next month. Emma will have care for 1 more year. After that, I don't know, but at least I won't hurt anyone else. I'm so sorry, Mr. Bennett. I'm sorry I robbed you of your health, your peace, your trust in human decency. You deserved better. Everyone I hurt deserved better. Eleanor Walsh. Enclosed was a cashier's check for $43,000. Thomas sat staring at the check for a long time. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, watching him. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. "I don't know. He called Preston. She's offering $43,000, full disclosure, complete admission of guilt. What do you think?" "I think we could get more if we go to court. Pain and suffering, punitive damages, maybe 75 to 100,000, but it'll take a year, cost you 10,000 in legal fees, and there's no guarantee she has anything left to take by the time we win. The house is being demolished. That asset's gone. If she's living on Social Security, we can't garnish it. We'd have a judgment and no way to collect. So take the $43,000. That's my advice. Yes, you're $43,000 richer than you were this morning. It covers your medical bills with room to spare. But Thomas, it's your call. If you want justice, if you want her held accountable publicly, we can absolutely pursue that. Thomas thought about Eleanor watching her husband die, about a grandmother choosing between integrity and her grandchild's care, about the impossible weight of loving someone whose needs exceeded your resources. He thought about David, about desperation driving people to betray the ones they should protect. "I'll take the settlement," he said, "but I have conditions." The meeting happened at Preston's office. Eleanor came alone. Patricia had offered to accompany her, but Eleanor refused. She looked smaller than Thomas remembered, frailer, a woman who'd carried too much for too long. They sat across from each other at a conference table. Preston had drawn up the settlement. Thomas had added 2 clauses. $43,000, Thomas said. "In exchange, I drop all legal action. But you agree to 2 things. First, you establish a pendile $5,000 for toxic mold awareness and testing for low-income seniors. Partner with a local nonprofit. Help people before they end up like me." Eleanor nodded. eyes wet. Yes, of course. Second, you talk to David, my son. Tell him what desperation looks like. Tell him where it leads. Tell him that sacrificing others to save yourself destroys you both. I'll call him today. They signed the papers. Eleanor slid the check across the table. Her hands shook. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. I don't forgive you, Thomas replied, but I understand you, and maybe that's enough. As Eleanor stood to leave, she paused. Your son loves you. He called me last week, crying. He wanted to know if there was anything he could do to make it right. I told him some things can't be fixed, only endured. After she left, Margaret appeared from the waiting room where she'd been sitting. That was remarkably gracious. It was self-preservation, Thomas said. If I spend the next year hating Eleanor, hating David, hating everyone who failed me, I'll become as toxic as that house. I can't afford that. But that evening, sitting in Margaret's guest room with his bank account suddenly $43,000 heavier, Thomas felt something break loose in his chest. He called Preston. I need to ask you something, Thomas said. Margaret Foster, the woman who took me in, can you do a background check? What are you looking for? I don't know. Something feels off. She's been too perfect, too helpful. Nobody's that selfless without a reason. Preston was quiet for a moment. Thomas, are you sure you want to do this? Some gifts don't come with receipts. I'm sure. The report came 2 days later. Thomas read it in Margaret's kitchen while she was at her book club. Margaret Foster, age 68, married to Robert Foster from 1978 to 2008. Divorced, no children. Robert Foster, Chief Executive Officer of Walsh & Associates Property Management, 1985, retired with a pension of $42 million accumulated through aggressive property acquisition and management. Thomas kept reading. The company had been investigated multiple times for fraudulent rental practices, hiding property defects, refusing to return deposits, renting uninhabitable units to vulnerable populations, never charged, always settled out of court. Robert Foster had died wealthy. Margaret had received half in the divorce. She had $21 million in various accounts and trusts. Thomas heard the front door open, Margaret's voice calling out that she was home. He sat at her kitchen table holding the report, understanding flooding through him. Margaret appeared in the doorway, saw the papers. Her face went pale. How long have you known? She asked quietly. 2 days. Why didn't you tell me? She sat down across from him. Because if you'd known who my ex-husband was, what his company did, you never would have let me help you. You would have seen me as part of the problem. Are you part of the problem? I didn't know. Margaret said, not for the first 20 years. I thought Robert ran a property management company. I thought we were successful because he was good at business. Then in 2006, a woman showed up at our door, 72 years old. She'd been evicted from one of Robert's properties because she couldn't pay rent after her apartment's heat broke in January. She showed me court documents, emails, proof that Robert knew about the heat and refused to fix it. I started investigating, found hundreds of cases. Elderly people, poor families, vulnerable people systematically exploited. You divorced him. I took half his money, and I've spent the last 16 years trying to atone. I've helped 83 people, Thomas, paid medical bills, legal fees, moving costs. I volunteer at senior centers. I watch for predatory landlords. I couldn't undo what Robert did, but I could try to balance the scales. Thomas looked at this woman who'd saved his life, who'd given him shelter and comfort, and never asked for anything in return. You're trying to buy redemption. Yes, Margaret said simply. Is it working? Thomas thought. About Eleanor selling her house to pay him back. About David's $78,000 debt. About his own choices and failures at both. About the impossibility of being human without hurting someone. I think, he said slowly, that we're all trying to buy redemption in one way or another. The question is whether we're paying with our own currency or someone else's. I'm using Robert's money, Margaret said. Does that count? I don't know. Thomas folded the report. But you saved my life. That counts. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the spring evening was turning to dusk. Somewhere in the city, Eleanor was setting up a fund for mold testing. David was sitting with his debts and his shame. Dr. Morrison was treating another patient. The world kept turning. There's something else, Margaret said. 3 days ago, David came to see me. You blocked his number, so he couldn't reach you. He asked me to give you this. She handed Thomas an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $22,000 and a note in David's messy handwriting. I sold my truck, my tools, Grandpa's watch, everything I had worth anything. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's everything I can give you right now. I'm paying back the rest at $200 a month from my new job at the Toyota plant. I know you told me to get out of your life. I'm not asking you to change your mind. I'm just asking you to know that I'm trying to be the son you deserved, even if it's too late. David. Thomas stared at the check. $22,000. David had liquidated his life. He came here every day for a week. Margaret said. Sat on my porch. I'd bring him coffee and he'd ask if you were ready to talk. I kept saying no. Then this morning he brought the check and said he wouldn't come back, that he'd respect your boundaries. Thomas thought about his son on Margaret's porch, waiting, hoping, trying to find a way back from betrayal. Call him, Margaret said gently. You don't have to forgive him, but let him stand up, let him try. That night, Thomas called David. The phone rang 4 times. He almost hung up. Dad. David's voice was raw, hopeful, terrified. I got your check, Thomas said. I know it's not. Stand up, David. What? Stop apologizing, Sty. Stop explaining. Just stand up and tell me, are you gambling? No. I joined Gamblers Anonymous. 4 months clean. Are you working? Yes, assembly line. $8 an hour, but it's steady. I see my kids every weekend. Good. Thomas took a breath. Here's how this works. You pay me back $200 a month like you promised. No excuses, no exceptions. If you miss a payment, we're done. If you lie to me again about anything, we're done. If you put your needs before other people's safety ever again, we're done. Understood? Yes, I understand. I'm not ready to see you yet, maybe in a few months, maybe longer, but you're still my son, and sons get second chances. David started crying. Thank you, God, Dad, thank you. Don't thank me, just Do better. Be better. After he hung up, Thomas sat with Margaret in her living room. She'd made tea, the chamomile blend that helped him sleep despite the residual pain in his back. "You're a good father," she said. "I don't know about that, but I'm trying to be a good man. That's the best I can do." "It's enough," Margaret said. "Trust me, it's enough." 6 months passed like a slow exhale. Thomas's back healed in layers first. The infection retreated. Then the raw flesh scarred. Then the scars softened from angry red to pale pink. Morrison declared him medically stable in August. The wounds had closed completely. He'd carry the marks forever, a topographical map of suffering etched into his skin. But the pain had faded to a dull memory. The lawsuit settled in July, with Eleanor's $43,000, David's $22,000, and the $8,000 from the church fundraiser that Gerald Hoffman had finally repaid. Thomas found himself with $73,000 more than he'd started with before giving David the initial loan. His medical bills were paid. His credit cards were cleared. He had a financial cushion for the first time in 2 years. He moved out of Margaret's guest room in September, finding a small apartment in a newer building with transparent maintenance records and functioning ventilation. Margaret helped him move. Of course, though Thomas did most of the heavy lifting himself. His body had grown stronger. Physical therapy and daily walks around the lake had rebuilt the muscle he'd lost during his illness. "You're sure you don't want to stay longer?" Margaret asked, setting a box of books on his new kitchen counter. "I'm sure." "You've done enough, Margaret. More than enough. You know where to find me if you need anything." "I do." He hugged her. This woman who'd saved his life for reasons that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with her own journey toward redemption. Thank you for everything. David's first payment arrived on September 1st, exactly $200, with a short note. "Month 1? See you at month 12. They spoke on the phone every few weeks now. Careful conversations that avoided the past and focused on the present. David's job at the Toyota plant, his kids' school activities, the weather, surface-level things that felt like building blocks toward something deeper. In October, Thomas received a call from a woman named Sarah Chen. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Sarah Chen. I'm a caseworker with Elder Services of West Michigan. Eleanor Walsh gave me your contact information. She said you might be interested in helping with a new initiative." The initiative was a toxic mold screening program for low-income seniors. Eleanor had established it with $5,000 as required by the settlement, but she'd added another $15,000 of her own money. They needed volunteers to help coordinate screenings, educate tenants about their rights, and connect people with legal resources when landlords refuse to address problems. "I'm not sure I'm qualified," Thomas said. "Eleanor said you're the most qualified person she knows. You've lived it. You understand what it's like to trust someone and have that trust destroy you. We need people who can speak from experience." Thomas thought about it for 2 days. Then he called Sarah back and said yes. The work started slowly, 1 screening a week, then 2, then 4. Thomas met elderly people living in conditions that would have killed them given time. He helped a 74-year-old veteran named Marcus Thompson get his landlord to remediate black mold in the bathroom. He connected an 81-year-old widow named Ruth Anderson with legal aid. When her property manager refused to fix a roof leak that was causing widespread fungal growth. Each person he helped felt like a small redemption, not for what had happened to him, nothing could redeem that, but for what he could prevent from happening to others. In early November, David called with a different tone in his voice. Nervous, hopeful. "Dad, I know you said you needed time, but Thanksgiving is coming up, and the kids keep asking when they can see Grandpa again. I was thinking maybe you could come to dinner at my place. Nothing big, just family." Thomas hadn't been in David's home since before the illness. Hadn't seen his grandchildren in almost a year. Emily would be 9 now. Jake would be 6. "Where are you living?" Thomas asked. "That's the thing." David's voice carried something Thomas couldn't quite identify. "I bought the house on Lakewood Drive." Thomas went cold. "Eleanor's house. The one that nearly killed me. Hear me out. After they demolished it, the lot went up for auction. I bought it for $18,000. I've spent the last 4 months rebuilding, completely new foundation, new everything. I hired inspectors for every stage. I have documentation of every material used, every system installed. Dad, it's safe. It's the safest house in Grand Rapids because I made sure of it." "Why would you do that?" David was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed to take the place that represented my worst mistake and turn it into something good. I needed to prove to myself and to you that I could build something instead of destroying it." "Will you come see it?" Thomas agreed. Not because he forgave everything. Forgiveness was a process, not a moment, but because his son was trying, because effort mattered, because families were built on second chances, and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear. Thomas drove to Lakewood Drive with Margaret in the passenger seat. She'd been invited too. David had insisted. She saved Dad's life. She's family. The house was unrecognizable. New construction, modern lines, large windows that let in floods of light. David stood on the front porch as they pulled up, and behind him Thomas could see movement, his grandchildren peering out the window. "Welcome," David said. There was an uncertainty in his posture, a question in his eyes that asked if this was okay. If Thomas could stand to be here. Thomas climbed the steps, looked at his son, really looked at him. David had aged in the past year. Gray streaked his temples, lines bracketed his mouth. He looked tired but clean, present in a way he hadn't been before. "Show me around," Thomas said. The interior was simple, but well built. Hardwood floors, clean walls, a kitchen that smelled like roasting turkey. Emily and Jake hung back shyly until Thomas knelt down. "I heard someone here is learning about Abraham Lincoln," he said to Emily. Her eyes lit up. "We're studying the Civil War in school." "Well, I taught history for 32 years. Want to hear a story?" They spent the afternoon like that telling stories, playing games, letting the children fill the spaces where words were still too hard. Linda arrived around 3, and Thomas felt his breath catch. She'd let her hair grow longer. She looked good, healthy, happy. "Thomas," she smiled, uncertain. "David said you'd be here. I hope that's okay." "It's good to see you, Linda." They'd divorced 10 years ago because they'd grown into different people who wanted different lives. But sitting at David's dining table as Linda passed him the mashed potatoes, and Margaret carved the turkey, and his grandchildren argued about who got the bigger piece of pie. Thomas remembered why he'd loved her, why part of him still did. The doorbell rang. David answered it, and Thomas heard Eleanor Walsh's voice, tremulous and apologetic. "I know I wasn't invited, but I brought something." David brought her into the dining room. Eleanor looked smaller than ever, holding a covered dish like a shield. She saw Thomas and froze. "I made sweet potato casserole, Robert's recipe. I don't know what I thought. I should go." "Stay," Thomas heard himself say. Margaret was already pulling out an extra chair. They made space at the table, added another place setting. Eleanor sat between Margaret and Dr. Morrison, who'd been invited because David wanted to thank everyone who'd saved his father's life. As they settled in, Thomas looked around the table. His son, who'd betrayed him and was rebuilding trust payment by payment. His ex-wife, who'd come back when he needed her most. His grandchildren, innocent and bright with the future. Margaret, carrying the weight of her ex-husband's sins and trying to balance cosmic scales. Eleanor, the woman who'd poisoned him, now sharing a meal in a house built from the ashes of her worst mistakes. Dr. Morrison, who'd saved his life with antibiotics and straight talk. "I'd like to say something," Thomas said. Everyone quieted. "A year ago, I was dying in a house full of mold. I'd lost everything, my health, my citizens, my dog, my son's respect, my faith in people. I was alone on a floor covered in blood, and I thought that's how my story would end." He paused, his throat tight. Emily reached over and I took his hand. "But I survived. Not because I was strong, I wasn't. Not because I deserved it. I'm not sure any of us deserve the grace we receive. I survived because people showed up. Margaret found me. Dr. Morrison fixed me. David came back. Eleanor owned what she'd done. We're all broken people trying to put ourselves back together with pieces borrowed from each other." He raised his water glass. The others followed. "This Thanksgiving, I'm grateful not for what I didn't lose, but for what I found. I found out that strangers can be angels, that hurt people, but healing people heal people, that it's never too late to become the person you promised to be, that love doesn't end, it just waits. And I found out that the real wealth isn't in my bank account, it's right here, around this table." Linda was crying. Margaret was crying. Even Eleanor had tears streaming down her face. "To second chances," David said, his voice breaking. "To second chances," they echoed. They ate dinner, and the conversation grew lighter. Emily told Thomas about her school project on the Gettysburg Address. Jake showed him a drawing of a dog that looked nothing like Max but somehow captured his spirit. Margaret and Linda discovered a shared love of mystery novels. Dr. Morrison and Eleanor talked quietly about mold remediation techniques, the doctor offering professional advice without judgment. After dinner, Thomas stepped outside onto the back deck. The yard was still mostly dirt, but David had planted a sapling in the far corner, a maple tree, young and green and reaching toward the sky. David joined him. "I planted it last week in memory of Max. I don't know. I thought you'd want him remembered here." Thomas stared at the small tree, and something inside him broke open, not painfully, more like ice melting after a long winter. "Thank you," he said, "for this, for all of it. I'm still paying you back. $200 a month, every month. I know, you haven't missed one. They stood in silence, father and son, watching the sunset over a yard that had once held poison and now held possibility. Dad. David's voice was small. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? Really forgive me? Thomas thought about Eleanor's letter, about Margaret's 16 years of atonement, about his own failures as a father, the ways he'd been too strict or not strict enough, too trusting or too cynical. I think forgiveness is like that tree, he said finally, but you plant it, you water it, you give it time. You don't know exactly when it becomes strong enough to stand on its own. You just keep tending it, and one day you look up and it's there. David nodded, wiping his eyes. I'll keep watering it. So will I. Inside, someone put on music. Thomas heard Linda laugh at something Margaret said, heard Emily's voice raised in excitement, heard the sounds of family messy, imperfect, impossible, necessary. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, lonely, sick, dying slowly in a toxic house, too proud to ask for help, too tired to fight. That man was gone. In his place stood someone who'd been broken down to nothing and rebuilt himself with borrowed parts, Margaret's generosity, Linda's care, David's desperate attempt at redemption, Eleanor's painful honesty, Dr. Morrison's skill. The scars on his back would never fade completely, but neither would the knowledge that he'd survived the unsurvivable, that humans were capable of both terrible cruelty and astonishing grace, sometimes within the same person, sometimes within the same day. Through the window, he saw Eleanor, helping to clear the table, moving carefully like someone who expected to be told to leave. Margaret caught Thomas's eye and smiled, that knowing smile that said they understood each other, two people trying to earn redemption they weren't sure they deserved. The maple sapling swayed in the November breeze, its small branches casting smaller shadows. In time, it would grow tall and strong, its roots spreading deep, its leaves providing shade for David's children and their children, a living monument to Max, to survival, to the stubborn persistence of hope. Thomas went back inside, back to the warmth and noise and complicated love of family. He was home. If Thomas's story touched your heart, you're not alone. Every day, people just like him face impossible choices between trusting others and protecting themselves. His journey reminds us that our darkest moments don't define us, but how we respond to them does. The scars we carry, whether on our backs or in our hearts, become testimonies to our survival. What strikes deepest is the truth that redemption isn't reserved for those who never fall, but for those brave enough to stand back up. Thomas learned that asking for help isn't weakness, but wisdom, that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves, and that family isn't just about blood, but about who shows up when we're broken. His story proves that even when betrayal comes from those closest to us, healing is possible when we open ourselves to unexpected grace. The maple tree planted in Max's memory reminds us that from the soil of our deepest pain, new life can grow. We don't need to carry our burdens alone. Sometimes salvation comes from a neighbor's knock on the door, a doctor who truly listens, or a son who finally understands what it means to make things right. Have you ever had to rebuild trust after a deep betrayal? What helped you find the strength to forgive or move forward? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.